It was supposed to be a fresh start. I had just closed on my dream home after years of saving, surviving a bitter divorce, and grinding through 12-hour shifts to get my life back. Silver Oak seemed perfect. Peaceful. Clean. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever went wrong. At least, that's what the real estate agent said. What no one told me about was the woman who thought she owned the entire block. Karen. The very first moment I arrived, she was already there. Clipboard clutched in her arm like a weapon, oversized sunglasses hiding eyes that seemed to scan for weakness. She didn't even wait for me to step out of the moving truck. "You can't park here," she barked, standing with arms folded. HOA Regulation 12A. No large vehicles obstructing the roadway. I told her I was just moving in, would be done in a few hours. But that didn't matter. She squinted at me like I was trespassing on sacred land. "Who approved this sale?" she demanded, like she ran some secret homeowners council that blessed every transaction. I replied calmly, "It's my house now. I closed on it last Friday." That was the moment everything changed. Her face twisted, not just in disapproval, but in control lost. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. This was about power. She stormed off without another word. 15 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled up. An officer stepped out, casual but alert. Apparently, someone had called in a suspicious person entering a home that didn't belong to them. The officer asked a few questions, and I showed him my ID and closing documents. His tone shifted instantly. Apologetic. He even muttered that this kind of call was becoming common in Silver Oaks. The officer left. Karen didn't. She stood on her porch with her phone, watching. Scowling. Making it known that she wasn't done. By the next morning, I had a violation slip in my mailbox. Trash bins visible from street, $75 fine. Then another. Lawn length exceeds acceptable limit, $50 fine. And another. Unapproved welcome mat, $25. I wasn't even fully unpacked. But she had made up her mind. I was going to be her target. One of my neighbors, an elderly man named Joe, shook his head when I asked him about it. "Karen's been running the HOA like her own little kingdom," he said. "You either fall in line or get buried in fines." She was relentless. Every minor detail of my property became an excuse. My mailbox height. My garden hose being visible. The color of my door, which she said wasn't in harmony with community standards. It became a game to her, one I wasn't supposed to win. And every time I tried to talk back or challenge the fine, she'd recite the rulebook like scripture, but I noticed something. The rules weren't clear. Some were half-written. Others vague. And many of them ended with a line that said, "Subject to HOA board discretion." Which, conveniently, meant her discretion. I asked to see who the board members were. She said that wasn't public information. I asked when the last election was. She claimed it had been held recently. No one I spoke to remembered voting. She was bluffing, hoping I wouldn't press further that I wasn't going to be another one of her pushovers. She didn't know that I wasn't just some guy with a mortgage. I had spent the last decade working as a civil litigation attorney. I knew the system. I knew how to fight, and I knew when someone was trying to hide behind authority that didn't actually exist. She thought I was just another homeowner. She didn't know I was exactly the wrong person to try to bully. So, I started collecting everything. Every notice. Every email. Every time she walked past my home taking photos. I installed security cameras. I backed up footage. I read every word of the HOA bylaws she kept quoting and realized she was violating several herself. She had weaponized the HOA to satisfy her own ego, and no one had dared to challenge her, until now. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just going to push back, that I was going to dismantle her entire empire, piece by piece, using the same rules she'd used against me. She didn't stop after the police call. In fact, that was just her opening move. Within a week, I had 6 different violation slips, each more absurd than the last. She claimed the grass was too tall, even though I'd mowed it the day before. She said the blinds in my upstairs window were not uniform with community visual standards. One notice accused me of improper recycling bin placement, because I left it out 2 hours early on pickup day. None of it was serious, but all of it carried fines. Her message was clear: leave, or pay until you do that. I tried contacting the HOA directly, but all emails bounced back. The number listed on the HOA website routed to a generic voicemail. Everything funneled back to one name, Karen. At this point, I knew she wasn't just some grumpy neighbor. She had made herself judge, jury, and enforcer. And no one had stopped her because they were too tired or too afraid to push back. When I knocked on neighbors' doors to ask about it, most just gave cautious looks. A few offered sympathy. One woman whispered she fined me $500 last year for having wind chimes. Another warned, she's been in control so long people assume she's legally in charge. That assumption was her power. She relied on people not knowing how HOAs actually worked. But I knew. I started going through the fine print. HOAs require elected boards. They require open meetings. They require documented processes for enforcing rules and collecting dues. What I found instead were gaps. Big ones. There hadn't been a board election in years. There were no published minutes. Fines were issued on plain paper with no signatures, just a typed name at the bottom, Karen L. Not even a title. The most telling moment came when I attended an HOA meeting. It was held at the community clubhouse, with about 12 people in the room. I raised my hand to ask a question. Karen ignored me. I tried again. She glanced at me, then turned away. Finally, I stood up and said, I have a right to speak as a homeowner. She shut me down cold. Not during closed session, she said, then ended the meeting 5 minutes later. No votes. No agenda. Just her sitting at the head of a folding table reading a list of made-up violations. That night, I reviewed footage from one of my security cameras. Karen had walked into my backyard. No knock, no permission. She was taking pictures of my patio furniture, which she later cited as an unauthorized structure, and fined me another $500. It was beyond harassment. It was trespassing. And that was the last line she was ever going to cross without consequences. That I printed screenshots. I built a file. Every notice, time-stamped. Every instance where she violated protocol. I found a clause in the bylaws requiring official records of board meetings, and I requested them in writing. She didn't respond. I sent the same request certified mail, which she refused to sign for. That refusal alone was a violation. Everything she did to me became another entry in a growing list of abuses. She wasn't just bending the rules, she was making them up as she went, and she was confident no one would ever hold her accountable. But what she didn't know was that I had also found her signature on several HOA expense forms, one of which paid over $15,000 to a landscaping company. A company with no business license. A company registered to her home address. That was more than rule breaking. That was financial misconduct. Maybe even fraud. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to bury her with her own paperwork. The more I dug, the clearer it became. The HOA was a puppet show, and she was the one pulling every string. But puppets only dance when no one's watching. And I was watching now, carefully, methodically, legally. I wasn't angry. I was focused. Because the only thing worse than someone obsessed with control is someone who thinks they can get away with it forever. She believed she had me cornered. But what she really did was walk into a trap. One she built herself. And now, every fake fine, every lie, every power move would come back to haunt her. Not in anger. In facts. Cold, legal, undeniable facts. Her empire was about to collapse. And she was still sitting on her porch, thinking she'd won. Within days, I submitted a formal complaint to the County HOA Regulatory Board, complete with copies of Karen's and signed violation slips, security footage of her trespassing, and screenshots of her unlicensed landscaping payments. I followed up with a written request for a legal audit of Silver Oaks HOA Board, attaching proof that no election had been held in over 5 years. I made sure it was sent through a certified process that required her to acknowledge receipt. She didn't. That, again, was recorded. While I waited for the county's response, I did something Karen hadn't expected. I started talking. Not yelling, not threatening, talking. Door to door, neighbor by neighbor. I showed them what I had: documents, timelines, laws. Some had their own stories: fines for flower pots, threats over parked cars, and even accusations of discrimination. What shocked me most was how fast the mood shifted. People weren't afraid anymore. They were furious. She'd pushed too far, and now they had proof that I encouraged them to sign a petition to initiate a special election, as permitted by HOA bylaws. We needed at least 25% of the homeowners to trigger it. I got over 50% in 3 days. People were done being quiet. Karen had ruled like a monarch, but she had no throne without the community. And now, the community wanted her out. When she received the petition, she called an emergency meeting. I attended, along with 24 other residents who had had enough. Karen tried to shut us down as usual, waving her binder of rules. But I brought a notarized copy of the bylaws, the original governing documents for Silver Oaks. She didn't expect that. I read the clause aloud that allowed for member-initiated elections. Then I passed out copies to everyone in the room. Her face drained of color. She tried to argue procedure. I calmly explained that as an attorney and homeowner, I was within every legal right to enforce those rules. I reminded her of the fines she had issued without board votes, the trespassing, and the financial records that clearly showed misuse of funds. Then I asked her directly, "Do you deny authorizing payments to a company registered under your name?" Silence that I didn't need her to answer. I'd already submitted everything to the state attorney general's office. The HOA regulatory board had acknowledged receipt of my complaint and had opened a formal investigation. I had a copy of that letter with me. I read it aloud, word for word. It stated that until further notice, all HOA enforcement activity in Silver Oaks was to be suspended pending legal review. She couldn't speak. Couldn't stop what was coming. For the first time, she had no control. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in unity. People cheered. They clapped. They volunteered. We formed a temporary committee that night to manage neighborhood operations until the election. Karen stormed out without a word. By the following week, the community had voted to remove the current board. I was elected president by a near unanimous margin, not because I wanted power, but because I promised transparency. We rewrote enforcement policies, eliminated petty fines, and set term limits for all board members. I opened the HOA books to the public. Everything was documented, everything was fair. And as for Karen, she received formal notice of an audit from the county. Her role in the HOA was terminated. She was barred from holding any official position in the community again. When the audit concluded, they found over $30,000 in misappropriated funds. She was ordered to repay every dollar. Civil charges were filed. Some neighbors told me she quietly sold her home and moved out. Others said she still denies any wrongdoing. Either way, her power was gone. Silver Oaks changed. Lawns still got mowed, bins still got picked up, but the fear was gone. People waved again. Talked again. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. That I never raised my voice. I didn't have to. I let her write her own downfall, one fine, one lie, one abuse of power at a time. All I did was hold up the mirror. And when the truth stared back, she couldn't look away. Months after Karen's fall, the impact of what had happened continued to ripple through Silver Oaks. The community was no longer quiet out of fear but energized by a sense of shared ownership. People took initiative. Block events were planned, gardens were maintained, and for the first time in years, board meetings were filled with genuine conversation rather than scripted monologues. The air had shifted. Not because of me, but because people had remembered their voices mattered. The new board worked efficiently. Fines were reviewed by committee before being issued. Every meeting had a published agenda. Budget reports were transparent, posted online monthly, and open for resident review. What had once been Karen's personal playground was now operating the way it was always supposed to, fairly, clearly, and legally. What surprised me most was how many residents started stepping up. Joe, the quiet retired man next door, volunteered to manage landscaping coordination. Tanya, a single mother who once feared Karen's constant citations, offered to help with community newsletters. People who had once hidden indoors were now leading the way. It turned out, all they needed was for someone to break the illusion that Karen's authority was absolute. Once that spell was broken, everyone realized the power had always belonged to them. The county's investigation closed with a full report detailing Karen's misuse of funds, unauthorized enforcement, and refusal to follow election protocol. She was fined, required to repay the HOA, and barred from working with any homeowners association in the state. That part of the story ended quietly, with no final outburst or attempt at redemption. She simply disappeared, another chapter closed, another name forgotten by a neighborhood finally healing. Still, I kept everything, documents, emails, videos, filed away in digital folders. Not out of spite, but because I knew stories like this weren't rare. Across the country, power was often handed to people simply because no one else stepped forward. That silence created tyrants. And I wasn't going to let that happen here again. One afternoon, a neighbor from a nearby subdivision knocked on my door. He had heard what happened in Silver Oaks and asked if I'd help them set up a proper HOA election. Their board hadn't held a vote in years, and they were facing similar issues: mysterious fines, ignored complaints, and a president who acted like royalty. I agreed to help, not as a lawyer, not as a reformer, but as someone who had once been forced to fight for the simple right to enjoy his own home in peace. What started as one conflict had grown into something larger, a shift in how people viewed authority in their communities. They realized rules weren't the problem. Abuse was. And when people stood together against it, even the most entrenched power could be undone. Silver Oaks flourished. New families moved in. The reputation of the neighborhood changed from one of control to one of unity. The property values rose, but more importantly, the trust between neighbors did too. People shared tools, mowed lawns for each other, and looked out for the elderly without being told to. It became the kind of place that brochure writers always promised but rarely delivered. As for me, I kept my role simple. I served my term as board president, trained my successor, then stepped aside. I didn't want to be the next Karen. I wanted to be the last person who had to fight one. I returned to my work, planted new flowers in the yard, and finally, months later, sat on my porch in quiet peace. No clipboard watchers. No fake citations. Just the hum of life in a place that had finally remembered what community really meant. It didn't take anger. It didn't take noise. It took clarity, consistency, and the refusal to be bullied. Karen thought she could control people by using rules as weapons. What she forgot was that rules work both ways. And if you know how to read them, they become tools, not to dominate, but to defend. In the end, Karen didn't just lose power. She lost the one thing she had used to maintain it: fear. And once that was gone, she had nothing left.